demand for all these minerals, solar technology. And then also, this is something I'm going to take a little bit more deep dive into.
I don't know what is
How it's impacting our national security, both in the United States. How do we make ourselves more resilient to price fluctuations in the market? And so we're in the process of getting Joseph Sobchak from our DoD office online to talk a little bit about progress they've made on that project. Getting U.S. federal dollars out to our provinces and states to help facilitate some of these programs, not only in the mining industry, but also in workforce development, some of the other innovation technology space. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and start with our introductions. I'll have all of our panelists introduce themselves and say a few words pretty quick, and then we'll go into a quick presentation from Joseph. We're still getting the technical side of it worked out on a little bit of updates.
I have no idea.
That's the project. So with that, I'll on the end with Mike Satre from Hecla Mining. Hecla Mining is in Idaho, Alaska, a couple of different places, but I'll let him go ahead and just introduce himself and say hi to everybody. Then next to him, we have Melanie Welsh from Alaska Unlimited, looking at the economic development side of things and how communities can be engaged when we're doing developments on these projects. And then next to her, we have Craig Fleener with the Ted Stevens Center, looking at the security side of things, so Arctic domain awareness, some of the other areas that they work, but also in critical minerals, U.S. Canada, Arctic domain awareness too. And then lastly, Nalaine Morin from Skeena Gold and Silver in British Columbia. It's going to talk a little bit about some of the work they're doing in their projects. So with that, I'll kick it off to Mike and have him go ahead and say a few words.
Yeah, no, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. It's a real honor to come present to PNWER. My name is Mike Satre. I'm the Director of Governmental Affairs for Hecla Mining Company. I was born and raised in Southeast Alaska, and then spent the first half of my career as a geologist in both open pit and underground operations, primarily on the operating side. I'm far too submissive to be an exploration geologist. I want to see ore and waste, but I had a chance to move home to work for Hecla back in 1999, and have been there since. 10, 12 years ago, took on an external affairs role. For those of you who don't know Hecla, we are a 133-year-old American mining company. Our roots are in North Idaho. Our office is in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. I just came up from there yesterday, and we have mines in Idaho, Alaska. We have, and those are both silver, lead, zinc, and gold mines. We also have a gold mine in Quebec, and then 2 years ago, we purchased a silver mine in the Yukon. So we're the largest producer of silver in the United States, as well as the largest producer of silver in Canada.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And go ahead with Melanie.
So, good morning. My name is Melanie Welsh. My Yupik name is Bunny, and I'm actually originally from Western Alaska, but in Welsh Canada. Fourth generation gold miner, grew up in a gold mine and small passion mine in Alaska, so understand this space quite well. Moved back to Alaska in 2016 and created a company called Alaska Unlimited, AU, and then understood the importance of building base-up economies to be able to create an economic development organization that focused a lot on resource development, focused in national security, focused on workforce development, small business development, and in a portfolio for cultural sustainment, how we can go and grow these things in our state and how we can move and advance Alaska forward.
All right, morning everyone. I'm Craig Fleener. I'm originally from Yukon, born and raised in Alaska. I'm with Chandler for 25. I work as a Department of Defense Director. Security sites, security cooperation, partnering primarily with our Arctic allies. I used to say Arctic partners and allies, but now that all but one of the Arctic nations is now part of the alliance, we're all allied members now. And so I think, well, before I say that, I have absolutely zero knowledge or understanding or experience in mining. So I just want to get that out right off the top. But I do think in terms of national defense, I worked in Alaska for 2 years on national security issues. That's the military my life is working in Alaska on wildlife fisheries issues. Worked for my tribal government for 16 years, doing a whole bunch of different things up there. So I used to look at things through the lens of being just an Alaskan and not just an Alaskan because we're pretty darn cool, but being an Alaskan. And when I looked at things through the lens of being an Alaskan, or when I worked at the state of Alaska, looking at things through that lens, I thought of economic development and job security and subsistence and how we can be sustainable as a state. When I moved over to the Department of Defense, of course, more of that defense lens sort of bubbled to the surface, and I started looking at all of the things that we've been working on in Alaska through the lens of national defense. And one of the big things that has been, I'd say, problematic down through the years is that all of the beautiful resources we have in our state, whether it's fisheries or timber or anything we used to harvest or continue to harvest or will mine or harvest in the future, it seems to me that we're sending too much that stuff to our adversaries. So I look at issues like critical minerals or mining or anything like that now through this very lens. Whereas, yes, I know we need to be concerned about the Pacific Northwest region as a whole. I think we also need to work together to make sure that we're focusing on national security, because when we're strong as a state or a province or a territory, we're strong as a region and we're strong as a nation. And with so much of our beautiful limited resources going to a strategic adversary, I think that's a very bad position. It may put us in a great position right now when the money is flowing freely. But I think in the long term, that's a strategic disadvantage. And then eventually it will put us at a disadvantage within our own region. So this is sort of the direction that I'm going to be talking about today in our video. So, and that's it. Thank you. Thank you.
Chocholone Hotia, Nalaine, Morin, Osha. Good morning, my name is Nalaine Morin. I'm a member of the Tahltan Nation. I currently hold the role of Vice President, Environment and Regulatory Affairs for Skeena Resources. I've been in this role now for 2 years, and I do have people often ask me why I took on a role with industry. And you know, for me, anyone who knows me knows the thing that drives me is seeing opportunity for First Nations to have a say, to exercise their sovereignty in natural resource development projects on their territory. So in my career, I've had the opportunity to work for both provincial and federal government Canada, as well as Indigenous nations governments, including my own, to work on policy development and tools to make change. And so today, in the talk that we're going to have, I hope to share with you some of the things that we've been able to successfully in creating partnerships and opportunities for many nations in the province of BC, the Tahltan Nation specifically. So the company I work for, Skeena Gold and Silver, we are currently looking to develop or reopen what was the previous Eskay Creek mine. So the new name of the project is the Eskay Creek Revitalization Project. Open pit, gold and silver, but a number of critical minerals, which I'll be talking about today. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that. I appreciate all that. And then we're going to try our remote speaker and see if we can hear Joseph Sobchak from DoD.
Just unmasked or something. I want to ask him to unmute.
Oh, Joe, are you?
Hello, can you hear me?
I think we got your audio for the back there, but not this. Hold on one second.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? This is Joe Sobchak.
Give us 1 second, Joe.
Okay.
We can hear you, but not on the main speaker.
Yeah, so as we get the technical details figured out for we can, talk a little bit about jump into the question we had too. Really, we wanted to have him give a little bit of an update on some of the findings we have on. So we're going to talk about potential mining in Idaho, and then also some of the graphite one mine here in Alaska. But one other item too I wanted to bring up, which is related to workforce. They are funding a project on tech, where this USB fix. So there's two things that you can highlight. We'll discuss a little later. This one has a back. Let's go ahead and jump so question here. Really, we wanted to headphone talk a little bit about this jack to roll in here. So how like we were trying to showcase what's after all issue I was working on last week. There wasn't a lot of state provincial talk. It was a lot of federal top-down talk. And so really wanted to ask the question about, how can the state and provincial policies investment in infrastructure, partnerships, self-insured program succeed and address the political needs we have. And then also, looking at that, how do we support federal initiatives that are beneficial for our states and provinces? So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Mike to lead off and just kind of give a little bit of comment on those topics.
No, thanks. And, maybe I will start from a high level. I've been in the mining industry a long time, always proud of what I've done. It's been a life-changing career for me and my family. But for many, many years, if I sat on an airplane seat and someone said, "What do you do for a living?" You had to say, "I want to keep this one, don't want to talk about mining, where this person approached mining." But in the last couple of years, especially post-COVID, and as people realize that our supply chains are at risk and mining and getting into the supply chains, mining become the belle of fall to some extent. We're needed to these sorts of activities and talking about talks about slowing in, making sure that our communities are sustainable. We are protecting our supply chain, bringing some of the production home. It's great to see Department of Defense and Department of Energy weigh in on critical minerals. But they're doing that from their department's point of view. And on great programs that, and a lot of our companies are taking advantage of it. My executives are always telling me, "Mike, that department for capital projects, we want to work through that." But we lack coordination at the federal level in how we're approaching the mining industry. Canadians, critical minerals, the United States, not left agencies, and quite frankly, DOD and DOE who are doing great work, LM and part of agriculture, Forest Service aren't talking. So we're not working in the same direction. And because we don't have that coordinated approach at the federal level, I think we're lacking this approach to the states and states on it's a better relationship on the Canadian side. But we're lacking that alignment of, hey, we want to focus on development of the industry. How can we partner together? How can states and local governments work on facilities and infrastructure? Whether it's big picture stuff, our ports, or whether it's the local level of just where do you put workers if they're coming to your town, those in the mining industry. And so what I hope is going to move forward, if you have discussions like this, is that we can do, we have greater outreach between the federal and the local and state governments, come together, develop that long-term strategy, and then be able to look at it from a regional perspective as well. Not only mining, but facilitate economic development through the region, because that rising tide needs to lift all boats. We can't just do it for one industry. It's got to benefit.
So thanks for that, Mike, and I appreciate that. I know the alignment was a big question mark we had when we were talking about just what's going on with our federal partners, even just in the U.S. more particularly, just is DOD and DOD following each other, or all the three-letter agencies, just the same language, and then who's directing that from the executives. So I appreciate that. So jump over to Melanie. I don't know if you wanted to kind of tackle this one from more of a community-focused perspective, and just how your vision for economic development feeds into these larger projects. How our national security offer.
Learned that one before. So it's fantastic to be able to have this discussion, but I do go and argue that we're having these discussions in these circles, but it's not necessarily getting down to the individual society. And so much when you're talking about three on the flame, you're wondering if you're wanting it to engage in those discussions. The reality is that There is an element of social engineering that does happen in our communities. And that in order to be able to move forward on any resource development project, especially in the mining space, there needs to be a significant component of education. You're talking about what the need is, how we're going to get there, and what we need to do to accomplish that. And we need to understand adversarial nations and what their points are, why they're trying to go monopolize these areas. As a fourth generation gold miner, I've absolutely seen the market manipulations. I've seen the trends, and I've seen projects be stopped because of that. So there needs to be more of a concerted effort on how we're going to address that, how we can bring awareness to this, and what we could do in in these areas to be able to make sure that we can actually do resource development. We could lift these areas up. Another area we talked about in the previous plenary session is energy. The cost of energy has to be affordable to be able to do these projects. And although we have these kind of fragmented programs that exist at a big level, still not being able to see many of those dollars that we can actually use. So there needs to be more develop strategy to be able to understand how we could deploy those dollars, how we could fund programs, and what Alaska funding looks like. Because Alaska funding is not the same as funding other national programs. The dollar in Alaska is not the same as the dollar in Texas. And so what we can do to be able to make sure that we're actualizing those monies in these communities will be absolutely necessary to be able to confer with Alaskans to say, how do we actually see those monies and that impact in those communities? How can we see energy, affordable energy in those communities? And how can we build opportunity based on that? With the Arctic strategy that was released for the region is a really fantastic document. It talks, it's far reaching before it kind of gives lip service. And it sounds fantastic to be able to invest in indigenous communities, to be able to build opportunity, but the reality is we haven't seen much implementation on that. So it's going to be absolutely necessary to be able to hold that accountable for the federal government to say, let's actually pieces of this Arctic strategy. Let's see them deployed in our local communities. Let's see them deployed around Alaska, and let's see the investment by 100% to be actually investing in ports and this capture and energy. Other areas of committing reform, I feel like that's a huge topic. I still don't think we have really good answers or any solid kind of understanding about what's going to happen in that area. We talk about it, we say that number one, we need to address this, but I still don't see much progress being made as far as what the federal government's doing to address that. And then pencil and paper, we need to understand education. So education, workforce development, strategically investing in programs for the next iteration of the state and the next industries of the state. We need to be focusing our post-secondary dollars in those areas. We need to be understanding what those greatest impacts are. So industry absolutely needs to be leading this, not necessarily academics and how we've been monetizing post-secondary education. And industry needs to be dictating what the needs are going to be for the next generations of Alaska, the next forecasts of Alaska. So the reality is that economic development happens in 20-year buckets. Typically, large projects, large mines happen a lot longer than the 4-year administrations that happen in the state and the federal government. So the reality is that we need to be able to pull some of this independently and develop those public-private partnership models to be able to make sure that we're seeing the longevity of these programs sustain the administrations and not wax and wane with private and interests.
Thanks for that, Melanie. I know, all those components are really important to us, and I was going to pivot a little bit for Craig just on as far as the federal national security posturing, but as far as states and provinces, what are you seeing? I know that there's been a lot of communication between networks in Canada and U.S. on this topic, and I was just curious as far as how jurisdictions can help.
Well, that's a great question, and I think something that we don't do enough of. I think I promoted the idea as long as I've been alive, and it's the idea of East-West collaboration. It strikes me as pretty darn odd that Alaska is less than an inch away from Yukon territory, but we do nothing together practically. I mean, there are a few things that we do together, especially where roads and communities are connected in Southeast. But we're not developing energy projects together. We're not looking at how to solve rail, road, transportation issues. We don't even work really very well together on fire problem. I was just in Yellowknife a couple of days ago. And we were talking about the fires that happened last year and the many large fires that have been going on for the last decade now, and the lack of capability that really exists across the north. So when a province or a territory or the state of Alaska is in trouble, we should be able to call on our neighbors and say, hey, can you send some firefighters over? We're about to evacuate a community. So I think this goes along the same lines of what we need for critical minerals support for each other. I just don't think that we work together very well. We're really good neighbors. We've been friends for a long time. I got good human relatives on the other side of the border. And the idea that we don't talk is just bizarre to me. We're talking here, sure. We talk in other venues. We really don't make things happen. For Alaska, and it's probably somewhat similar across the northern tier of Canada and probably even Greenland if you want to look at all of the North American Arctic. It's an interesting thing how infrastructure is built out across the north. For Alaska, there's an interesting history that basically tells us that if it was not for a national security imperative, Alaska would have no infrastructure. You can go back as early as World War I and the need for coal to put into our World War I ships. If it wasn't for that need, we wouldn't have built the first railroad in Alaska. You can go forward to World War II and look at the Alcan Highway. If it wasn't for II and the invasion of Alaska and the occupation of Alaska, the need to defend Alaska, we wouldn't have built the Alcan Highway. And you have to ask yourself, if we didn't even have World War II, would we ever have built that road? Because we haven't built a railroad. And Alaska is a strategically important minerals, mining, timber, et cetera, location. As a matter of fact, you could even put a port in Alaska, cut off the Great Circle Route, and get some of those goods into Alaska, put them on rail, get them to Nashville 3 to 5 days before you can get them through the traditional routes, because our infrastructure in the lower 48 at ports is crumbling and is overwhelmed. So there's an awful lot that we can do, but we don't do it. So Alaska really has only been built out because of national security narratives. That goes forward to the Cold Bowl with the Dew Line and White Alice sites, and then the influx of military folks that really has made Alaska what it is. If it wasn't for these events, Alaska would probably have 100,000 people and no infrastructure to speak of. You can move forward to TAPS, where we had an enormous increase of our population that came about because of the oil crisis and the need to make sure that our petroleum reserve was full. And I can go on and on. The fact of the matter is, Alaska doesn't have the population or the money. We certainly wouldn't have had it if we didn't have these national security imperatives. We don't have the resources, human resources, we don't have the capital, and we don't necessarily even have the investment outside of national security investment for Alaska to be a player in the game. And I think it's the same way all the way across the Arctic. So my response there is, by golly, we gotta work together. And I think part of the response actually is, and I found it on one of the magazines upstairs when I went up there, it's the idea of building a critical minerals alliance. And one of our, this sort of goes beyond the question, I hope you don't mind. One of our big problems, as I pointed out, is an awful lot of our beautiful resources go to our strategic adversaries. Well, why aren't we working together with our partners, with our allies, to put together a cradle to grave critical minerals process where we determine where they are, which we've already done for the most part. We go out and get them. We refine them locally, and when I say locally, I mean amongst our partners and allies, which could mean Canada and the United States. It could also mean our other partners and allies. But we avoid sending these beautiful, limited, hard to get resources to an adversary who has already told us we want to become the global, and we want to be the lead in economics across the world. That's our fault if we let that happen. We have the wherewithal. We just don't have the will. So let's get to will. I think that is what the federal government needs to do. I think it's what you all as individuals need to tell your respective elected officials. Let's put together a critical minerals alliance. Maybe we start with the U.S. and Canada. Or we put together a critical minerals alliance all the way to producing the material that goes into our warfighting and defensive capability, our cell phones, our medical capabilities, whatever we need. Let's make it ourselves. Relying on someone else who wants to see us in decline doesn't sit well.
Thanks for those insights, Craig. Yeah, there's been a lot that's been going on. But you see fits and starts with our federal partners. That's part of it. So we're going to talk more about how do we get over this hump? How do we constantly give message to them that we want to see these things progress? And so with that, I was going to jump back to you on just that community engagement. How does your organization work with the provincial and federal government in Canada to ensure that you're getting what you need and they're getting what they want? So
Excellent. Yeah, no, I'm happy to share, some of the experiences and the success that we've had today. And fundamentally, it's built on ensuring that you've got those solid relationships with communities. Canada and British Columbia both accepting the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and BC moving on to create the Declaration of Indigenous Peoples Act has really changed and refocused the relationships and the work that's being done to move towards reconciliation. So with that in mind, and looking at the development of the State Creek Revitalization Project, we are the first mining project, I would say, in North America, where there's recognition of an Indigenous government making a consent decision on our project. Right? This decision will align with BC's environmental assessment process. So in order for our project to move forward on our environmental assessment certificate, we will need some consent decision from the Tahltan central government. So in order for us to do that as a company, we really have to focus on ensuring that the Indigenous government and the nation, the Tahltan Nation, has the information and the capacity that they need to be able to move forward in executing their environmental assessment strategy. Let's just take a moment there and reflect on that. Now, in British Columbia and across Canada, there are a number of different First Nations today that have their own impact assessment process, environmental assessment process, where they're actually implementing their own decision-making process to move forward the project. On our SK project, we actually have 3 different First Nations that are doing exactly that. So the Tahltan Nation, with their consent decision and environmental assessment strategy, we are also working with the Nisga'a Nation, who under their treaty, we are implementing Section 10 of their treaty, which is their environmental assessment on our corridor transportation route. And we're also working with the Gideon Nation, also on the transportation corridor route, implementing their lilt sustainability process, right? So we're talking 3 independent First Nations, all implementing some decision-making process on the Escape Creek project. You don't do those things lightly, right? Relationships is a really, really important. That commitment to, each one of the nations to make sure that they're successful in executing their processes. And all of this starts with that commitment, both from the provincial and the federal government, to recognize the roles, the rights, the responsibilities of First Nations in Canada.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. I know that's a big piece of what we were talking about with the topic on reshoring and friendshoring, and how we talked about re-engaging on these minerals and And in order to do that, we have to look at the regulatory environment, we have to look at processing, we have to look at now concerns and needs. And so with that, you know, as the whole life cycle as Craig alluded to, and I know that we did mention a little bit on the circular economy cycling crew from products we currently have, because it's running the cheapest and cattle and something. Get back market. But you're going back to this question about the need for environmental impact statements. You know, how states and federal governments do it. Is there alignment that could be happening there? You know, is there timelines that could, you know, definitely be reviewed and kind of thing? And not put Mike on the spot, but I don't know if you can comment on any of that, or just in general terms, you know, some of the things you see there, just like the easy ones that the federal governments can do to address some of these things in the immediate timeline.
Yeah, so a lot of my work is dedicated to either assisting our teams with permits and trying to move through the process, or trying to find ways at both the state and national level in both Canada and the United States to accelerate those timelines, because mining investment capital needs certainty. And if you look at the S&P Global report that came out earlier this year, in the United States, we're looking at 29 years from exploration success to mine production. And that's something that we just simply have to improve on if we're going to provide the metals that our nations need. Unfortunately, you know, we have projects in Montana that have been in permitting for over 35 years. They weren't always our projects, but now they're our project. We're trying to move them forward. You know, we have, you know, a project here, you know, our mine here in Alaska, multiple EISs just to get very small expansions over time, and working through that process is always time consuming and expensive. As we have expanded into Canada and specifically the Yukon, well, in Quebec as well, you know, we find that all of our experience on the U.S. side of the border really means nothing on the Canadian side of the border. We're used to here in the U.S. the federal government drives permitting, it drives NEPA. States are cooperating agencies. Maybe they have privacy on a few things, but ultimately it's the federal government that drives it. Whereas on the Canadian side, as Canadians well know, it's the provinces and the territories and quite frankly the First Nations that drive the process. And each province and territory is different. You know, we got to the Yukon and started to have to, because we immediately needed permanent expansion to the property that we bought to make it profitable. You know, we learned rather quickly that you do not move forward without complication with First Nations on those territories. And we're, you know, we were in a working relationships with First Nation, not sure down up there, and we'll through some of their concerns. But then the Yukon Territory has 3 different pathways of the permit. We're trying to get that final permit going forward, and almost none of that touches the federal government. And one of those pathways is, you know, very aptly named the water board. You know, it is a water board process to get your permit through that. So you know, we would all love to see consistency in permitting. I think when you look at the environmental standards on both sides of the border, they're actually very close, because we all know the science. We know what impacts there are to the wetlands and the habitat and to water. And so if the standards are the same, you know, I think it'd be nice to find some way to align the process, which unfortunately will never happen. So I think it's upon us to, especially in these, you know, when we're looking at Yukon and might have your path slap. This will be rather in the scenes. They're just concerned. Well, we have to work on sharing our knowledge, both the regulators and the companies that are sharing our knowledge on that business right now. Is ultimately on both sides of the border, these are highly technical, you know, documents that are sharing the process, and most individuals are asking. And they don't know how to sit down 600 page or, you know, a 1,000-page environmental assessment in Canada and figure out what they should be concerned about. So we need to be better at sharing what that process is from a high level, and then, you know, companies, First Nations, regulators need to be better about saying, this is how it impacts you. Let's try to distill this down to what this means to you as an individual, as a citizen on the other side of the border, and how you can then comment in the process. and know that your comments really do it's not just for the science that we do as well. So like it's a sticky wicket. I think we all want to find ways to improve it on both sides. And some of it is simply making sure that we're out in front of the process, that we are doing the proper consultation, we are working with communities before we get that process and try to prevent a project, and we're working in a spirit of collaboration instead of just saying, here's our project, please permit it, because we're going to reach out to that. It's a very different world than what 2030.
Yeah, I appreciate those comments, Mike, and I know Nalaine had some add-ons to that too.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, environmental assessments are not 1,000 pages. They're about 20. We just submitted our initial environmental assessment application in August, and it was 20,000 pages. The amount of time and resources that go into putting those together are astronomical. I mean, I think, just at a very high level, we spent more than $20 million putting this application together. Right, and we need that, to move forward as a project. But if you can imagine, for the large teams of, experts that we have putting these things together, we now rely on First Nations to provide meaningful input into these processes. And, there are nations that have more than one of these applications that they have to review. And I just don't think that we do enough to take that into account, to take that into consideration. And I think if I may, I appreciate, the level of detail that goes into these things and the commitment by both the federal and provincial government in terms of environmental standards, right? Because at the end of the day, we as an industry, we're doing better. We're getting there, it's incremental, but we are doing better. But I don't think we do enough to take into account, the work that companies are doing as a company to recognize, the global, local industry standards that are in place that make us do things better as well. Things like the Mining Association's towards sustainability, TSM standards, cover a number of areas, that make you a better miner. And I don't think our regulators recognize that enough. I think there is opportunity for process efficiency there, not only with what First Nations are bringing to the table in their review of these applications, but also when you've got, companies that are doing the work, that are achieving certain standards and are doing things a certain way. Why are we not getting recognition for that? Ultimately leading towards a more efficient process. In Canada, there is efforts that are being made and have been over the last couple of years to try to create some other efficiencies in the process, like the substitution process that exists between provincial and federal governments on the impact assessment. But also now today, with critical minerals driving, there are regulatory reforms that we are looking to implement, where federal and provincial governments are aligning on regulatory processes so that, we're not having to do, we still have to achieve various federal and provincial permits. But at least if there's coordination between the federal and the provincial government, there can be efficiencies gained, more specifically time, which, is something that we're all, driving towards. So.
I appreciate those comments. I know it's been an ongoing conversation. I know that it has a lot more bipartisan support in our U.S. federal Congress. There's been the reform bill has been mentioned quite a bit here today and also in other forums, but it seems like more and more we're seeing a lot more projects that just aren't being completed or delayed. It doesn't matter if it's a mine, be a wind farm, solar farm, any type of power generation or transmission line for that matter. So it's just an ongoing challenge that everyone's seeing across the board, and hopefully we, get this attention to our federal partners. So, yeah, something needs to be done to advance this a little bit more. I was gonna tag onto the de-risking comment. So I know that we talked a little bit about it in the past. I guess, do you have any thoughts any more on de-risking? I know Melanie asked put you on the spot. We did talk about just that engagement piece and financing, so some of the other things on the economic development side. I don't know if you have any initial thoughts or comments.
De-risking is a really interesting conversation because the reality is unless you have a closed system, you're really not going to be able to do anything to counter what China's been able to do. They monopolize the market there. Instantaneously, they can manipulate the market and they can bankrupt companies, which they've done many times. So in order to be able to actually look at solutions for de-risking this, there has to be, as Craig alluded to prior to, there has to be an alliance of sorts to be able to understand more so about resource nationalism, to understand what we could be doing in Alaska, to be able to create whole supplies, how we can be mining, how we can be processing, how we can be supplying our nation. But it needs to really get into that area. I've had discussions with the U.S. Department of Commerce about using specific funds for investment in infrastructure and projects in Alaska to be able to use perhaps tax revenues for Alaska Native corporations to be able to leverage those dollars that we see in Alaska to be able to move projects forward so we can be able to address significant capital needs that we have. But the reality is that G7 has done some positioning on that and others have done some positioning on that, but it's really going to take a concerted effort with allied countries to be able to create that alliance, to be able to create that supply chain, and then be able to understand that in a global market that involves China, it's going to be a very difficult landscape to be able to actually do so.
I appreciate it. Any other comments on the de-risking? Oh, go ahead, Craig. Or did you? Oh, Melanie first. Oh no.
Oh, okay,
well, good.
I didn't want to step on your toes, sorry. I think there's de-risking externally, which Melanie was just touching on, and I think there's some internal de-risking as well. I know that I've heard a lot down through the years about lease sales or whatever in Alaska, and the thought in general terms is that it just ends up being money giveaway because the potential for that lease to actually go all the way through to become a viable project is pretty doggone slim. So lots of money is being paid out, permits may be issued, and then permits may be withdrawn. So I think that's an area that needs a lot of focus. It seems like there's also too close of a connection between maybe the regulatory side and the enforcement side. And I know this is pie in the sky thinking, but it seems to me that if someone wants to develop a project, yes, we need environmental, but we need to be environmentally aware of what we're doing and take care of the environment. I come from the land, I completely support that. Don't want a free for all out there. But if someone is sold a piece and then given a permit, the idea that that's banked back partway through the process, I think is quite terrible. And the thought that there's going to be an enforcement overburden on the process once permits are issued, I think is an area that needs fixing. I don't know how to do that. That's not where I work, but I would like to be able to walk into whether it's a state, provincial, territorial, tribal, First Nations, whichever office, apply for my permit and actually have the help of that agency to do what they are mandated by law to assist me in doing, and that I am willing and wanting to do so that I can benefit the community, the state, territory, and ultimately the national government. So I think there needs to be a heck of a lot more support. I know when Mark Myers and I worked together in state government, there was a pretty good permitting process in place where I may be oversimplifying it. He's much smarter on these things than I am, but there was sort of a process in place where you you've got walks through from door 1 all the way to door 20. And maybe it wasn't that easy, but it was certainly easier than the federal process. And I think something like that needs to be put in place. If we don't want a project, we need to tell people right away. So $1 billion isn't spent, 10 million, $20 million isn't spent. If we want that project, then we need to get to that point where we're working together to make that project happen. All the way through environmental assessments and everything. Doesn't mean we cut corners, do everything that we need to, but knowing someone is on your side, and I think that'll make everything a lot better. On the external side of de-risking, Melanie sort of pitched this as a softball, so I just want to read something from here that goes right along the lines of the need for de-risking through an alliance. And this, again, that I got upstairs, Critical Minerals Alliances, says monopoly, not hypothetical. China's ability and willingness to leverage its critical minerals dominance as a geopolitical tool and trade war weapon is not hypothetical. Back in 2010, the communist countries restricted rare earth exports, means of punishing Japan during a dispute over sovereignty of islands in the South China Sea. As a result, the prices for these skyrocketed, and a global rush to discover and develop deposits outside of China erupted. So we want to prevent that sort of activity taking place in the future. We have to take the bull by the horns. We have to work together. We have to form this alliance and make something happen. We can't just talk about it anymore.
So thanks for those comments, Craig. I know anecdotally it came up, I was at a meeting last week and somebody had mentioned the U.S. transitioned the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Part of the reason that the U.S. was viewed on is because the Arab countries got really put into detail embargoes or really hit the United States back on the other side of things. And so when you see those types of things, like you mentioned, that's just one example. But there's opportunities for U.S. to protect themselves from adversaries that don't always align with ours. So with that, I was going to check and see if we weren't able to get our GOD speaker. They had the technical issues with it. One thing I would just kind of mention on the federal side of things. So as many of you track this, the bipartisan infrastructure law, and then also the Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of the funding that are coming out of those programs, whether they get renewed or not, it's up in the air. And so there's and then in particular for this program, the Defense Production Act is up for renewal next fall. So you see some of the things changing there with that program. But the hope is that more awareness is given to our federal partners about this in the U.S. and that those programs that I mentioned earlier that were been funded through that Perpetual Mine program in Idaho, and then Grant 1, and now Montana Tech's Workforce Development Program, get some more awareness on those. So we have a little bit of time. We can open it up for questions if anybody has any. Have one in the back. Oh, we'll wait until we can get you the mic there.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Rachels. I'm with Idaho National Lab. Hi, maybe the people on the figure that I recognize. In terms of the formation of an alliance on this issue, around that industry, I wanted to sort of tease out two threads of thought that were happening on this panel and sort of ask how to resolve it. So one is that, Craig made the case that in terms of Alaska, and I think this is true for sections of Canada as well, that national security concerns drove infrastructure development and development in general for some of our most rural and remote regions. And then that formed sort of a hub for additional economic development activity as a follow-on in the next few decades. But I see some really troubling signs on the United States side of this this notional coalition of folks forming around critical minerals. And that is that those investments in Alaska recently seem to be waning. I'm thinking about port expansion there. And the troubles on the horizon. I'm thinking about what seems to be a bumpy Eielson pilot project. We'll see how that shakes out. But there just seems to be a wiggle, and I want to know how we can resolve that. And in terms of providing that stable outlook that he was talking about here on the other end of the table, you know, what we can do about that as, people concerned about the industry. What avenues are available to us, that sort of thing.
I don't know if I can get directly at that, and then there's some great, that's a great question. And I think as a region, it's really important for us to focus on transportation and energy, because regardless of what critical mineral is the flavor of the day, if you don't have a way to get supplies to site or get materials to market or a way to power your operations or your community, it is going to be extremely difficult, if not possible, to develop it. And when you look at our, you know, our energy links between, you know, the Northwest region are essentially non-existent. So we need to start looking at our transportation links. You know, you look at developing the Yukon. The key to developing the Yukon is the ability to get materials in and out of the port of Skagway. And you have, you know, potentially one small local government that can control the economic future of an entire region north of it. So we have to make sure that we're looking, you know, working with, you know, with those folks to look at the big picture. You know, how can we mitigate impacts in that small town, but also allow, you know, if a cruise ship is in the way of the Petro Marine barge in Skagway, then Whitehorse doesn't get any diesel that week. Right. And I think that's what people don't remember is, you know, Whitehorse diesel comes from, you know, up through Southeast Alaska and up over the coast there. So we have to make sure we're working together there. And then we also have to look at our transportation linkages. When I was a kid, you could go Whitehorse to Juneau on a scheduled flight. You can no longer do that anymore. We're looking at, you know, using our mine in Juneau to help facilitate logistics and look for efficiencies of you know, people between, you know, what we're doing at Juneau and what we're doing up at Yukon, but we have our hands tied and how we do that. We need to be looking at how we increase those transportation links, whether it's our ferry system links between Southeast and British Columbia to encourage, you know, commerce there. Look at it, you know, between northern Southeast Alaska and the Yukon, and then look, you know, then starting with that, then looking at those energy links, so that we can start developing that infrastructure from the ground up. And now finally circling back to a little bit of your question is how do we keep investing in things like ports and energy going forward, you know, using mining and other big industries and potentially energy industries at the base. And looking at opportunities, you know, I think one thing that we always forget about is what's happening in Kitimat, where you have a purpose-built hydro facility where aluminum ores from around the world come and are refined and then shipped out. You know, we don't have smelters and refineries in the United States. You know, our materials either go to the Trail smelter in Canada, or they have to go to Japan, South Korea, or China. And so we should look at models like the Kitimat model for, you know, how can we, you know, do more economic development, support our industry, support our communities, you know, here in Alaska, and then be, you know, and make sure that we're leveraging this, you know, potential crisis mineral supply as that national defense imperative that really built that other infrastructure that Craig was talking. Anyway, so it's a little bit of a roundabout take on what you're asking.
Yeah, thanks for that. Anybody else? Oh, Melanie, go ahead.
And to jump into that, you know, it's really interesting to kind of to delve into this discussion about investment into the Arctic and the realities that we need to kind of in a global space. We need to be able to go and diversify our economies. We need to be able to create. I would say that in Alaska that we're quite reactionary with our economies, that we need to be strategic about how we're going to develop those sectors, those industries, and those clusters, and then be able to plan accordingly. And I think it's imperative to understand, you know, kind of what's happening in that space of micronuclear and what's happening in the space and resource development. We've seen the last 4 years when we've weaponized things like ESGs, and we've weaponized funding and investment in the Arctic spaces in the guise of climate change and the guise of other different things. But the reality is resource development that happens in Alaska, and I think it's nearly about half critical materials mines and prospective mines are on Indigenous lands. And I would argue that Indigenous resource development is the world standard for resource development because number one, we're always land and legacy focused first, beyond anything. And so how we're able to go and actually access and develop those projects and processes are going to be absolutely vitally important, and how that interplays in developing our state and how we're able to identify what we want to do in Alaska and how we do that forward will be vitally important. I'm interested to see the next 4 years in this administration and where that moves us and where the progress is made. But as far as nuclear and as far as Allison project, that's a very exciting idea and concept. And I think that what we're seeing is a lot of the applications for a catalyst fund projects in the state that can utilize and benefit from that.
I think in Alaska in particular, probably all across the north, we're really good at planning and talking. We come up with good ideas every single day. The tough part is implementing. And it's exactly as was said by the last two speakers. Really the biggest issues we have in Alaska, as you know, you all know this, the high cost of energy and the lack of infrastructure, any kind of infrastructure, road, rail, port, those are all critically important. And unless, the reason I use the phrase national security imperative is because unless we can convince others or have others convince themselves that there truly is an imperative in Alaska, we're not going to get the investment. I mean, just take a look back from 10, 20, 30, 40 years. The investment comes when someone else wants to make it, not necessarily when we ask for it. And so I think it's going to continue to be that way. So if we are able to convince others, or if they're able to convince themselves that national security is truly an issue and Alaska is part of the solution, then we'll get the investment like we did with the first railroad, like we did with the Alcan, like we did with TAPS, like we did with the new line, like we did with all our military bases, like we did with the F-33s, F-35, sorry. All of that came because someone else said, there's a reason to put that there. Even with economic development like gold and other minerals, those happened in a wisp of air in the past without infrastructure development. I mean, they were here and then they were gone, and no infrastructure was left to build upon. So we need something big. And I think the other part of a potential answer to your question is, I don't think the federal agencies do the jobs that they should be doing in Alaska to the extent that they should. And what I mean by that is, it seems like an awful lot of the projects are dollar-based instead of success-based. And if you take a look at the organic documents that created every federal agency and take a look at what their mission sets are, for example, if the Department of Transportation's mission is to build roads for national defense, to access resources, to open up the country for, there's 3 or 4 other things I can't remember right now. It's slipping my mind, but some good reasons to build roads. Those roads were built in the lower 48 and they accomplished those tasks. They haven't been done here yet. You can go through every federal agency and say, what is your mission? We are a state. Think. So the mission applies here as well. So the federal agencies need to, and I know it's expensive and it's hard to just say it, but they need to not just look at how much money is spent in Alaska, but how successful are we at implementing those projects? Do we have a successful port network that makes us economically viable? Infrastructure is the business of the federal government, right? That is what they should be doing, especially national defense infrastructure. And now the DoD or Department of War back in the days, they put a lot of money into Alaska. Probably still not enough for us to truly defend a 6,600-mile coastline. When you compare us to the rest of the country and the number of naval bases that are there to defend no longer at jeopardy coastlines, you would sort of think, oh, maybe Alaska should get a little bit of that investment because the East Coast is safe from Great Britain now. It's safe from the Barbary pirates. It's safe from, that first line of adversary that we were worried about in the 1700s and the 1800s. Alaska is 1.6 miles from a near adversary, and we're close to the next two, the closest to the next two of every other part of the country. So I would say that we need to get some effort by our federal agencies, and I know there are a couple of my friends in here who have worked for federal agencies and probably have better insights than I do. But I think getting them to think in terms of what do my organic documents say? What is my mission? Have I accomplished that in Alaska? And I think for many of the agencies, you'll be able to look at it and say, no, you have not been successful.
Well, thanks for that. Yeah, I appreciate that. I was just gonna mention we're at time, so I was gonna give Nalaine just a last shot if she had anything else she wanted to add. I know that everybody else had a chance to wrap up on that question. I don't know if you had, just in general, if you had a comment you wanted to close out with, or if we should just go right to lunch.
Yeah, it's always interesting to me to participate, and this is my second PNWER, to participate in opportunities to hear the American. Because we just focus on what's happening in Canada. I definitely see lots of opportunity here and opportunity for us to learn from one another. And I think I'll close with that.
I appreciate those comments, and as I mentioned, we are gonna start lunch about 15 minutes. So the speaker they have is the author of the book, The War Below, talking about critical minerals, mainly in the U.S. and some of the challenges. It's actually a really interesting read. But Perpetual Mine actually is one of those, he goes into detail out in one of the chapters, but he talks a lot about you know, what we've discussed today, just with the issues with, you know, how do we get these things moving? How do we get to here? 20 years of not developing our critical minerals and going in different directions. But anyway, looking forward to having everybody at lunch, and then we'll meet back in here after lunch for our other sessions we have this afternoon. So I know that I think, did you have any other things, Matt, you wanted to add, or is that pretty much it?
Transportation after lunch.
Oh, transportation. Yeah. Exactly. So again, you know, touching on these themes that we've gone through today with energy, critical minerals and transportation, everything, it's all interconnected, and really need to look at this as a holistic system. So with that, we'll leave that, and we'll go ahead and transition to the lunch. Thanks.